We ask that you would help us to understand your ways better as a result of today's study, and help us to understand better how you put your word together and what it means for us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Last week and this week and next week we're still introducing the book of Exodus, and the reason I want to do this is because when God dealt with Israel in Egypt, the question is, how much did they know and how much were they responsible for? When they saw God doing certain kinds of things, if they didn't know what was going on and God hadn't told them what to expect, then that's one thing. But if they had before them the book of Genesis, which they did, and if the book of Genesis lays out a whole bunch of patterns and teachings that feed into what God was doing in Exodus, then they're much more responsible. So, for instance, in the book of Genesis, you remember the story of Lot. Now, I'm sure when you went through Lot and you looked at the story of Lot, you didn't think about it in connection with the book of Exodus. But now we want to look back at Genesis for a couple of days and think about it as leading into Exodus. Maybe you did think about it. But what happened to Lot? Did he want to leave Sodom? No. So he had to be dragged out. Who dragged him out? The angel of the Lord. Did Israel really want to leave Egypt? Not really. And they kept wanting to go back. And who let them out? The angel of the Lord. Now, maybe you don't remember this, but it says that Lot made unleavened bread. And that's a real clue. It's Genesis 19, verse 3. When Lot tells the angels to come and spend the night with him, it says they turned aside to him and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread. And you say, why does the Holy Spirit bother to tell us that he made unleavened bread? What difference does it make? What if he made toast or donuts? Or they didn't have bread at all? Who cares? It doesn't say anything else they ate. It doesn't say whether they had lamb or pork, which they could have had at this stage in history, or chicken. The only thing we're told is that they had bread and it was unleavened. And I think the reason that Moses writes this in here is so that the Israelites will have a clue. Lot gets dragged out and he's taken into the wilderness, and Sodom is destroyed. And then God says, I want you to go to the mountain, the angel says. And you remember why Lot should have gone to the mountain? Who's on the mountain watching all this? Abraham. You've got to take the whole context here, but Abraham is standing on the mountain watching the destruction of Sodom. And when God says to Lot, go to the mountain, and Lot says, no, I really don't want to do that. I want to go over here to this other city called Zoar. Lot's making the wrong decision. He should have thrown in his lot with Abraham. That's always what they're supposed to do, is join up with Abraham. And Lot keeps not wanting to do that. So Lot goes out into the wilderness, and what happens to him there? Perishes. And his people become a bad nation. We know that Lot went to heaven, but in terms of history, he perished in the wilderness. Now, look at the book of Exodus and think of yourself as an Israelite that God is dealing with. You're supposed to know all this, right? You're supposed to have learned from it. What would you learn? When God takes you out to the wilderness and brings you to the mountain, Mount Sinai, you don't disobey, you don't refuse, or else you wind up like Lot. So that there are patterns in Genesis that feed into Exodus and the events we'll look at in Exodus. So y'all went through Genesis last year looking at all the trees, and what we want to do is look at a few forests that pertain directly to Exodus. And some of it will be review, and some of it maybe will be things that just in terms of looking at patterns that you didn't go over before. But we're going to look at Genesis through Exodus eyes for a couple of days. And the first thing I want to do, and this is really as much for fun as anything else, but I said I would do it last week, so briefly, is to talk about the 7-day pattern in the Bible. We looked at the covenant pattern last time, one of them, and how the book of Exodus fits in as the second of 5 books. So it's a book of transitions, a book that moves from an old order to a new order, from an old king to a new king, from Pharaoh's cities to the house of God. It's a book of transitions, and that's the second thing in our worship service, as God cleanses us and brings us out of Egypt and into the kingdom. This time let's look briefly at the 7-day pattern that you have in Genesis 1. You know Genesis 1, see. So let's just quickly review it. On the first day, you have on your notes here, God establishes the heavens and the earth, and particularly He sets up light and separates light from darkness. On the second day, you have the firmament and the separation of waters below the firmament from those above. And what is the firmament called? God called the firmament heaven. So what's the relationship between the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1 and this firmament heaven? The firmament heaven is a place within the earth that reveals heaven. It's a window into the highest heaven. But you've got two different heavens in Genesis 1. You've got the highest heavens that are made on the first day. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then you've got this firmament, which is the blue sky and everything in it. And that's called heaven because it reveals the highest heaven. It's a manifestation of the highest heaven within the world. On the third day, we have a separation of land and sea. And in the second half of the third day, we have the appearance of seed-bearing plants. There are two kinds of plants there. Who remembers what the two kinds of plants are? That's right. The foundations of bread, seed plants, and the foundations of wine, fruit plants. There's nothing said about tubers. There's nothing said about broccoli. Nothing said about lettuce. The only kind of plants the Bible usually talks about are bread and wine plants. Fruit that you can squeeze and make juice out of, grain that you grind up and make bread out of. And then the fourth day, the sun, moon, and stars are made, and they're made for a particular reason, to govern and to symbolize governors and to mark time, to symbolize a passage of time. So later on in the Bible, when the Bible talks about the destruction of Babylon, it says the sun, moon, and stars fell. The sun turned black. It was eclipsed. The moon turned red. It was eclipsed. We still have stars on our flag. In the Near East, they have moons and stars on their flags. They symbolize powers in the Bible. And that God established them to do that on the fourth day. And on the fifth day, and the fifth day is the most interesting, and we will spend some time on this later in Exodus. I just want to present it here. We have clouds of fish and clouds of birds. And these clouds that God sets up, we'll associate later on with clouds of incense and the glory cloud around God. The Bible makes that association later. But God says to these clouds of birds and clouds of fish, the first time He says anything about this, it says He blesses them, and then He gives them a commandment, be fruitful and multiply. Which comes first, the blessing or the law? The blessing. Grace comes first, then law. He doesn't say, be fruitful and multiply and earn the blessing. He says, no, I give you this blessing now, be fruitful and multiply. That's a fifth day association. On the sixth day, in the morning, we have the animals. In the afternoon, we have man. And on the seventh day is the Sabbath. Now, this pattern recurs in the Old Testament. For instance, we'll look at this later on in Exodus, but when God gives the rules for building the tabernacle, God comes to Moses and He makes 7 speeches. The first speech, He tells him to gather all the raw materials together to make the tabernacle and all the other things. The sixth speech are all the laws about the high priest's garments. That's a man. The seventh speech says, if you work on the Sabbath day, you'll be put to death. So you begin to see, and we'll look at this in more detail, that those 7 speeches correspond to the 7 days of creation. Now, why would God do that? Why would God give a series of 7 speeches corresponding to the 7 days of creation when He's describing how they're to build the tabernacle? What would that indicate to you about the tabernacle? You can guess. There's no punishment for guessing wrong. What does the tabernacle symbolize? That's right. It's a new creation. And it represents, actually, within itself, the entire world, and also represents man, who is the captain of the entire world. And we will find several series of 7s toward the end of Exodus where God makes this new cosmos and establishes a new world because the old one's fallen away. The book of Leviticus as a whole lays out in 7 sections. The 7 feasts of Leviticus correspond to the 7 days of creation, and the book of Revelation corresponds to those 7 feasts. On the Lord's Day, that's the Sabbath, that's the first feast. Then there is a word to the 7 churches that corresponds to Passover. Then you've got trumpets. That's the 5th feast, the Feast of Trumpets. It calls the assembly, the gathering of the cloud. Then you've got the Feast of Atonement, which is the 6th feast. It has to do with man and the reestablishment of man. In Revelation, that's the pouring out of wrath. against the wicked. Then you have the Sabbath, the Feast of Tabernacles, the last feast in Leviticus 23. In the book of Revelation, that's the new heavens and the new earth where God tabernacles with man. So we could, if we wanted to take a lot of time, make a big chart and show how these 7 general themes that God sets up in creation in the first place begin to play out in various ways. So what I want to do today, just briefly, is show you how there's a shadow of these 7 days in Genesis, the outline of the book of Genesis, which leads us to Exodus. And then there's a further shadow of those 7 days in the first 7 books of the Bible. And if you think this goes too far, that's okay. But, as I say, as we go through Exodus, we'll see more about some of these themes. Just think about Genesis now. We just finished studying it, so you remember the details and watch how they fall into categories. Genesis, as you remember, is divided up into sections that begin with the phrase, these are the generations of. These are the offspring of. Now you can also see those markers as coming at the end of a section. Scholars disagree, but one thing's for sure, you've got these sections. And you can break those sections down into 7 groups that very easily follow out the themes of the 7 days. For instance, the first section in Genesis follows the generations of the heavens and the earth. That's the creation of man, the beginning of the world. It's easier to see this pattern toward the end. Joseph being Sabbath pattern, the story of Jacob being a story of man, the story of Abraham having the themes of multiplication, blessing, and law. Those are the things that God continually says to Abraham. So you've got this in your notes. I don't want to try to argue it in detail now. Just show you that it can be done. Several different people have tried their hands at it, and this is how I see it working out. And you can glance through Genesis and see how it works. And see if you're persuaded that these, in a general way, the book of Genesis follows out the pattern established in Genesis 1. We could expect that. It's the way books are often written. But the question is, does it work? I think it does. Also, I think the first 7 books of the Bible follow this pattern. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. Of those 7 books, which is the one that talks about man being given a kingdom? It's Joshua. Joshua, they're given a new Eden. At the end of it, they're all living in it. The very last verse in the book of Joshua says that the high priest died. Why is that important? What happens when the high priest dies? That's right. Everybody who is hiding in the city of refuge gets to go back to his land. So the very last thing that happens in Joshua is everybody is on his land. Even the people who had to flee to cities of refuge have gotten to go home. And that's where it ends. Looks great. And what happens in the next book? Judges. Well, they don't hold on to it. And on the Sabbath day was when Adam fell. Deuteronomy has this theme of Moses gathers the people together. Big emphasis on law and blessings being given there. Genesis, of course, is the book of beginnings. In Exodus, as I will try to show you as we go along, the tabernacle is the place where God's heaven is visible on the earth. So it corresponds to the firmament. And in Exodus, we have this separation of waters. There are a lot of separation themes in Exodus we'll look at as we go. Leviticus, we have the further separation of the land and the sea. The land is Israel and the sea is the Gentiles. And Leviticus is so concerned throughout with these laws of how you keep separate and things that are distinctive for the Jews and not for the Gentiles. If you were a Gentile believer in the Old Testament, like Naaman the Syrian, or Melchizedek, or Jethro, did you have to keep the laws of uncleanness, or could you eat all the pork you wanted? Yeah, you could eat all the pork you wanted. Those laws of uncleanness were only for the Jews because you had to keep those laws in order to get into the tabernacle area to offer sacrifice, and if you were a Gentile, you didn't do that. And the book of Leviticus makes these separations real clear, and it's interesting, toward the end of Leviticus, you have the Jubilee year, which stresses how the plants multiply on the earth again. Now, Numbers, that's a different theme. In Numbers, there's all kinds of symbolism about heavenly bodies. And the numbers of the census figures of the Israelite tribes are the same numbers that show up in Genesis as the years of the lives of the patriarchs. Lamech lived 777 years, the good Lamech. Now, that number doesn't mean a thing to you except that you've noticed the number 7 probably, but it happens to be the number of days it takes for the planet Saturn to move around and come back to the same place in the sky. So it's a synodical period of the planet Saturn. It's not the number of days it takes for Saturn to go around the sun. It's the number of days it takes for Saturn to go around in our sky, which includes its retrograde motion and coming back to the same place. And those numbers, those planetary numbers and solar numbers and lunar numbers, show up in the years of the lives of the patriarchs before and after the flood. When God said to Abraham, look at the stars and this is what your seed will be like, part of what that would mean is Abraham's seed will be like these godly patriarchs who were the stars, the heavenly witnesses, before the flood and after the flood. And when we get in the book of Numbers and we have these censuses, we find these same numbers show up again in the numbers of people in the tribes. So there's an emphasis on the fourth day theme, and also, since they are to govern the nations, they're to lead them in worship. So in contrast to Leviticus, where the laws of uncleanness are designed to separate Israel from the nations, in Numbers, when these same laws come up, they have a different twist. If a Gentile believer who's uncircumcised wants to draw near and offer sacrifice, well, then this is how he can do it. This is how you lead the Gentiles. So I think that the first 7 books of the Bible play out in a very general way. It's not the only thing they do, but in a general way play out this same foundational theme. God is building a new world, building His world, and He uses the same pattern He used in the first place. It's not a strange idea to think about. And as we look at Exodus then, we will see firmament themes. Tabernacle is a firmament, and we'll see some separations of water, light going through the Red Sea, and some other things that will show up. But, as I say, we will have to come back to this when we get to building the tabernacle, because there are a whole series of 7s there. And we will look at this particular pattern in more detail at that time. I wanted to lay it out today, though, because I mentioned it last week. Unless you have a question you want to raise about this, I'd like to go into something that I think is a little bit easier to understand and more practical. Let's look at the Exodus pattern. And this is the important thing, because in the book of Genesis, there are a half a dozen or more exoduses. And these exoduses follow the same pattern as the book of Exodus. And they are types. A type is something that happens in history that foreshadows something that will happen later on in history. We're used to thinking of Old Testament types of Christ, but actually types run along in between. Abraham is a type of Jacob, and Jacob is a type of Moses, and Moses is a type of David, and David is a type of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is a type of Christ. And if we really want to understand typology, we need to pull it through like that instead of only jumping from Abraham to Jesus. Because it's helpful to see that when Abraham comes into the land, he builds altars at a place called Bethel, and one at a place called Shechem, and one at a place called Beersheba. And when Jacob comes back into the land, he builds an altar at Bethel, and he builds an altar at Shechem, and he builds an altar at Beersheba. And when Joshua comes in to conquer the land, he conquers Bethel, he conquers Shechem, he conquers Beersheba. Why? Because these are the core points of the land. And by marking out the land with altars, we start the conquest, because the kingdom starts with worship. Then later on, the army comes in and finishes up the conquest, but it's the same places. And that repetition of themes really sheds light back and forth. So what I want us to do is look back at Genesis at a certain constellation of things that show up several times that you looked at in detail last year. But we'll pull them out and see just the basic theme this week and next week, so then we'll be able to understand a little bit more fully what happens in Exodus. I won't discuss Noah's removal from captivity in the old world to the new. That's in Exodus, and the Exodus themes show up there. But let's, to start with, look at a very short Exodus that takes place in Genesis 11:27 to 12:5. This is just a short form of the Exodus pattern, which then will get expanded. Genesis 11:27. These are the generations of Terah. My interpretation would be this is what comes out from Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. What is Ur? It's a place where your sons... What happens in Ur? Sons die in Ur. We don't need to know that Haran died in the presence of his father Terah. Why does the Bible give us this information? Nothing is in the text by accident. Death and life is a major theme, particularly in Genesis. That's the curse. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, which means my princess, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And Sarah was barren and had no child. In your wife is dead too. Covenantal. If the seed of the woman is going to defeat the enemy, we got a problem. The woman's barren. Woman's always barren in the Old Testament, isn't she? Who besides Sarah was barren? The next patriarch's wife, Rebecca. And who was barren next? Rachel. What other barren women in the Old Testament gave birth to mighty messiahs? Samson's mother, Samuel's mother, John the Baptist's mother. Who's the fulfillment of that type now? Who are we moving toward? The virgin birth. That's your ultimate barren woman there. How does the virgin give birth? But these are problems in her. So, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they went out, Exodus, from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and settled there. So, here's another theme. We have Abraham, and who else went with him? Does Lot stay with him the whole time? On into the future? Or does Lot? No. So we really got two groups of people here, don't we? What can you see coming out here? The chosen and the mixed multitude. I would say that that's shadowed in here. And it says they came out. Did they go all the way to the promised land? And went halfway. So that's something that the Bible goes out of its way to tell us here. In the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So what happens here? Some people die in the halfway point. Just reading along here, deconstructing the text. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, from your relatives, and your father's house, to the land I'll show you. I'll make you a great nation. Will bless you, make your name great. You'll be a blessing. Bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All times of the earth will be blessed. Multiplication and blessing themes here. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And so you see some of the mixed multitude join Israel and come into the land with Israel. And we'll find that too. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and their possessions which they accumulated, and all the persons that they had acquired, literally converted in Haran. Doesn't mean people that they bought. It means people that they converted. It's a different verb. They set out for the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan, and Abram passed through the land as far as Shechem, side of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there where the Lord appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain theme. On the east of Bethel. Pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built an altar to the Lord to proclaim the name of the Lord. Abraham journeyed on, continuing toward the south country. So we have this. You finally make it all the way out, and you build an altar and establish worship. Now see, this is just a pattern. Now, if this just happened once, it'd be one thing. But when we see this happen over and over again, we begin to get a feel for something. This is a very simple form of the Exodus pattern. Now we'll look at a more complicated one. The next thing that happens. There was a famine in the land. Verse 10. This is the second one. Abraham coming out of Egypt. And this is a real model now for Israel. There was a famine in the land. Is that how Israel got down into Egypt later on? Yeah. Remember? They had to ascend down there to get stuff. So Abram went down to Egypt. Was there anything wrong with Abram going down to Egypt? Not at this point. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians were more or less the rulers of this whole land, as we'll see at this stage in history. So he went down to sojourn there. The famine was severe in the land. I think this is equivalent. The problems with your sons, the problems with your wife, that cause you to leave in this story is the famine. Now we have a threat. I have to insert this here, but we can't number them anymore. We'll call it should be threat against the woman, who is the bride and the mother of the seed. What's it say in Genesis 3:15? I will put enmity between thee and the woman. So does Satan attack the woman? Yeah. He attacks her just because she's the bride. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So there's two battles that go on. Satan attacks the bride, and he attacks the seed. Now there's a perceived threat against the woman when we get down into Egypt. And so Abram says to Sarai, see now, I know that you're beautiful, a woman of beautiful appearance. Then it will come about when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, and they'll let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, that I may live on account of you. Now, we debate whether Abram was right to do this or not, but one thing is for sure, this is part of the theme. The deception of the tyrant by the woman. How many women in the Bible use deception against a tyrant? How many can you think of? Is it right to deceive in wartime? I think so. I think the Bible teaches it is. So let's think of some women who practice deception. Who's the most famous one? Rahab. Rahab chooses to side with God's people and deceives the tyrant. Who's the next woman who practices deception? Jael. Remember, she lures Sisera into the tent and runs the tent peg through his head while he's asleep? It was on the battlefield. She changed sides. Now, before this happened, who were two famous women who deceived the tyrant? That's right, Shiphrah and Puah, in Exodus 1. While the Jews were in Egypt, Pharaoh said, kill the sons, but let the girls live. Why? Because Satan's got to raise up seed through those women. And so what did the midwives do? They deceived Pharaoh. They said, oh, these women, they give birth so fast we can't kill the boy babies. This says God bless them for it. Why do you suppose that it's the women in the Bible who seem to mastermind these deceptions? That's right. The woman was deceived in the garden. So eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, blow for blow for blow. Deception for deception. Deception is the tool of the weaker party, particularly of the woman, to evade the tyrant. Now, Abraham says, tell him you're my sister. And in fact, she was his sister, so it wasn't really a lie. What that would have meant was, this is the way you exonerate Abraham here if you want to. It's my inclination too, although this one, I don't guess it'll ever be settled until we're in heaven. The brother is the protector of the sister. And so if I'm Pharaoh and I want your sister, then I come to you. And what's Abraham going to say? Well, she's indisposed right now. She can't go out with you tonight, Pharaoh. So Pharaoh comes back 2 days later and says, I want to take your sister out on a date. Well, you know, it's the way of women, so it'll be at least a week before she can go out with you, Pharaoh. Pharaoh comes back and a week later, well, she's real shy and she doesn't want to go out, Pharaoh. He can string this on. What we're actually going to read is Pharaoh grabs her and takes her into the harem. So who's at fault? Who's the bad guy here? Who's breaking the law? Pharaoh. He attacks the bride. He attacks the bride. Now, I'm sure Abraham, nothing I've ever done has been without some sin. Nothing you've ever done has been without some sin. So maybe we should say Abraham doesn't come off smelling like roses here. I don't know. I'll let Calvin fight Luther on that. Luther says Abraham was fine. Calvin says Abraham was bad. And so you can choose. But it says in verse 14, it came about when Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful, and Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Was taken, and that we need to let that have force. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. Surely that's 7 things. It has to be. Sheep, oxen, donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. You have to have 7 things. That must just be a coincidence that there's 7 things mentioned here. I mean, it couldn't be a literary device. So now what's happening? What's happening while we're down in Egypt? Are we getting rich? Sure. Is that what happened to the Jews later on when they're in Egypt? Not only do they get rich, but before they leave the country, they go and they ask for things and get even richer. They didn't borrow things. You know, our King James Bible says, go and borrow things from the Egyptians. Of course, they never paid them back. It says, ask things. We'll get to that, of course, but you see the theme? They're in Egypt, they're getting rich. The Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. That's going to happen again, isn't it? Plagues. Why? Because he attacked the bride. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "This is all your fault. We blame the righteous. What is this that you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" We'll see with Pharaoh when he deals with Moses. He says, "Moses, this is all your fault. How come you're causing all this trouble for me?" Satan always tries to accuse the righteous. And this is the accusation against the righteous. An accusation. Turn the blame around. This is all your fault, Abraham. Your fault. It's not my fault. I mean, I take what I want, man. This was a pretty-looking woman. It's your fault. Now, why did you say she's my sister? And I took her for my wife. Now, then, here's your wife. Take her and go. He commands them to leave. And that's going to happen again. Pharaoh commands them to leave. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. They escorted him with his wife and all that belonged to him. Does the Egyptian army escort the Jews out of the country? In a way, they chase them out. They're trying to get them back. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him, and Abraham was rich in livestock and silver and gold. Well, when you come out of Egypt, you come out rich. And then he went back to where he'd been in the beginning and built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. When you come out of Egypt, you build an altar and call on the name of the Lord. Is that what's going to happen in the book of Exodus? Yeah. The whole of Mount Sinai is an altar with the fire on the top. And of course there are other altars that recapitulate. The altar in the Tabernacle, we'll see, was a model of Mount Sinai. And that's what makes it different from the altars the patriarchs had, because they hadn't come to Mount Sinai yet. See, only the priests were allowed to go on Mount Sinai, and only the priests are going to be allowed to go to the altar in the tabernacle. So they're going to come to mountain and call the name of the Lord. Now Lot and his herdsmen have strife with Abraham, and there's a separation. And God gives him all this stuff, and now we just want to briefly glance at chapter 14, because it also fits in here. After we come up from Egypt, after there's a certain amount of separation that takes place, then there's this big war. This war of the 5 kings against the 4 kings in chapter 14. And it's the Shemites who defeat the Canaanites in this battle. What's interesting is, the people who are defeated are giants. Shemites are giant killers. Now, after the Shemites under Chedorlaomer defeat these giants and defeat the Canaanites, then who defeats Chedorlaomer? Abram. Abram defeats Chedorlaomer with only 318 men. So now we see who really runs the land. Now when the Jews come out of Egypt and they start moving into the Promised Land, they're going to run into all the same people that Chedorlaomer defeated. Moses in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, he lists them all. And he says, hey, these are all the same people that Chedorlaomer, the Shemite, defeated, and then Abraham defeated him. If we were looking at Numbers and Deuteronomy, we'd see the same places are mentioned in Numbers 13 and 14, the same people are mentioned. And you see, this is history as prophecy and as lesson. The Jews should have looked back to Genesis 14 and said, yeah, when you come out of Egypt and you have all your spoils, and you go to conquer the land, Shemites have always been giant killers. Shemites have always been Canaanite defeaters, because they were here. But this time, of course, they all chicken out. And so they don't take the Promised Land and wander for 40 years in the wilderness. You see the theme? You see how Genesis is done? Now next time, we're going to have to look at just a few more of these. Lot's deliverance from Sodom we mentioned there, so we probably won't come back to that, but there's an Exodus aspect there. But then Abraham goes down and spends time with Abimelech in Philistia, and all the same things happen. Abimelech grabs Sarah, takes her into his harem. God visits him in the night. God plagues him. He gives Abraham a bunch of good things. He calls Abraham in and blames him and says, this is all your fault. Get out of here. Abram leaves. But then what's different is that Abimelech comes around a little bit later on and says, you know, I've been thinking. I think your God is probably the right God, and I'd like to be in alliance with you. Later on, Isaac goes into Philistia, and the same thing happens. Then Jacob, and this is another biggie, and we'll look at this in more detail next week, because it really lays a foundation. Remember, Jacob's other name is Israel. What happens to Israel in the Exodus already happened to Jacob when Jacob went into Mesopotamia. Because when he got out there with Laban, Laban reduced him to slavery. And Laban used up all the inheritance of his wives. But the whole time Jacob was there, he was getting richer and richer and richer. And Laban was getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And Laban didn't want Jacob to leave. And Jacob snuck out at night. And Laban chased after him. So all kinds of things that happen in the book of Exodus have already happened to Jacob when he left Mesopotamia. So there's another Exodus. So next week we'll look at these other little Exodus patterns, and we'll get more in our minds the things that we will see happen again in the book of Exodus when we get into it. We'll see this attack on the woman. We'll see the deception practiced against the tyrant by the midwives. And we'll see people getting rich, being driven out, being chased. All the things that happened already to the fathers will now happen to the sons. Any quick questions over this? My evidence that Adam fell on the Sabbath is twofold. One is, it seems that if Adam had obeyed God for any length of time, he would have built a pattern of obedience into his life. So that the fall of man has to happen right away, when Adam is still inexperienced. Second of all, because God came on that day to meet with them at the special trees, I assume, based on all the other things the Bible says about the Sabbath, that it's the Sabbath day. Yeah, I think they fell immediately. I think any other position gets you into difficulty.